Hey everybody. I apologize, this may be split into two because I simply might not have time tonight to actually do this review properly. As strange as this is going to sound, I don't have a lot of bullet points like I normally do on my list as I was thinking about what to talk about for this game. I say that's strange because FF9 is one of my favorites. When I was looking at, the FF series, when I was prepping for the work for the series as a whole, for when I was doing all of these reviews, I went ahead and made a list, 1 through whatever, of how many of where the game's listed for me. And there's a definite barrier point at which point the games stop being favorites. They're still great games, but they slink. They are no longer excellent. Every game in my 1 through 5, let me put it this way, is, in my opinion, a work of art. It deserves to be in that art category. Everything past that gets into the excellence, and then we drop very quickly from excellent to great to good, and we stay in good for the rest of the series. So yeah, this is a game that, as much as I have so little to talk about it statistically in analysis, the fact of the matter remains that it is still definitely one of my favorite games, and I want to get that point across. This is not a game I'm trying to slight by having a shorter review. I also am kind of short on time. I don't know if I mentioned that already. It's been a very stressful night. So, Final Fantasy IX, right? The number 5 slot, for anyone who's wondering, for me. FF9 was done as what I thought to be a good decision. They decided to go ahead and put forth the concept that they were going to be doing 3 new Final Fantasies, right? One was going to be done in the old style, one was going to be done in the completely new style, and one was going to be something that they'd never tried before, an MMO. This was in the pre-WoW days of MMO. This was in the second era of MMOs, as I've mentioned before. And so FF11 was very much poised to take a very large chunk of that, and it is worth noting that FF11 is still going today. So, sign of success there, I think. So what they did was they split the team up just a little bit and had certain people working on some and doing some crossover work and all that fun stuff. But there's something about FF9 I want to discuss in a way that's going to sound very geeky and very strange. For anyone who's not a Star Trek geek, or a Star Trek fan, or Star Trek aficionado, forgive me as I discuss something in brief here. When the Star Trek anniversary, I don't remember which one, because I'm not that much of a geek, came around, both Voyager and Deep Space Nine, which were out at the time, did an episode for the anniversary to celebrate, however many years. I think it was, no, it couldn't have been 25. It had to be more than that. 30 years, maybe? I don't know. To celebrate however many years of Star Trek, they wanted to do a special thing, right? Now, it is worth noting that both Voyager and Deep Space Nine approached the project with some degree of enthusiasm, and there was genuine effort put in for both parts, and both episodes were good. I'm just getting this point across because I, as many other Star Trek fans tend to do, tend to bash Voyager. But this is a perfect example of what I'm about to start talking about here. This is why I'm using this as an example. Deep Space Nine, the crew there, everyone put forth their effort. All the cast, all the writers, all the directing, every single person involved in the making of that episode put forth the effort to create an homage in celebration of the series, in celebration of the original series and all the characters therein, and to really expand upon it, expound upon it, and enthuse in it, right? Kind of like I try to do. The Voyager cast was nevertheless excited about it, but took an existing story and modified it to add in parts that were about the old thing. Now, the old parts were good. That was the one with Sulu, for anyone who's wondering. And seeing, I can never remember how to pronounce his name. I can't remember. I apologize, because he's a great actor, actually. I think he's awesome. And seeing him back in action like that was incredibly awesome, I thought. Yes, I'm looking it up right now because that's going to bother me. George Takei. Takei was what I was stuck on, obviously. George Takei. But as soon as I saw it written out, seeing George Takei in action and seeing the way they produced that, there was a genuine level of enjoyment there, right? But their approaches, their attitudes were so violently and noticeably different. One was... How do I put this? One was done to try and parrot the old stuff, and rather than celebrate it, well, I shouldn't even say that rather than. It was the different way of celebrating, but it was doing so by parroting, by aping, by I'm trying to think of a word that's a little less insulting sounding. You know where I'm going with here, right? It was done artificially. There we go. That's what I want to call it. It was done rather artificially. By contrast, the Deep Space Nine episode, which is Trouble with Tribbles for anyone, or Trials and Tribulations, I'm sorry, for anyone who's wondering. That episode was done as an homage with the intent of, again, celebrating, but it was done in a manner that you could actually feel the genuine passion that every member of the crew and the cast and the people behind them had for it, right? Why do I bring all of this up into an FF9 review? Because FF9 was designed to be the last old school game, and yet, indeed, it has been the last old school game, unless we're counting some of the other things they've been doing lately, which actually I kind of do because I actually really liked Final Fantasy IV Lights, or the four Heroes of Light, and in case anyone has not played that yet, I do actually recommend it. It's very fun. Anyways, but FF9 was the last Final Fantasy, proper Final Fantasy, that was done in the old system and in the old style and the old themes. And it's also worth noting that after FF9, the mere fact that it is debatable what constitutes the main FF series after 9, the fact that you could argue one way or another, kind of makes my point for me. FF9 was the chop-off point. That was the end of an era. Not saying that's good or bad, but it was very definitely different from that point on. Then we had 10. Then we had 10-2, which was a strangeness. Then we had 11, which didn't fit at all, and actually came out before 10-2. At least I think it did. In Japan it did, I know. And then we had 12, which was done as a Final Fantasy Tactics thing, so whether or not that counts is kind of up to certain people's interpretation. Then we had 13. Okay, we're kind of getting back to it. Then we had 13-2. Then we're going to have 13 Versus, which may or may not come out at this point. You get where I'm going with this. The very style of dealing with the series changed after FF9. So FF9 was, in basically every possible way, the last hurrah of what most of us who grew up on the older games, I was around when FF1 came out, for God's sakes, most of us saw as the end of an era, the last true Final Fantasy. And I don't mean that to sound elitist. I mean it to say that the spirit and the feeling and the oomph that the old FFs had was present in FF9, and they went for something different for every game further. Just to make sure nobody misunderstands me for the 500th time, I just want to stress, I'm not saying the games after that were bad, okay? I wouldn't be reviewing them if I thought they were bad, in all honesty. I just want to get the point across that, in my opinion, what the FF series was stopped at 9. Everything past that, they could have called something different or gone with a different feeling or whatever. They didn't have to, mind you, because it is something different. I'm not trying to be anal about this. I'm not trying to say, oh, well, you can't call it a Final Fantasy. They can call it whatever they want. But FF10 and forward weren't Final Fantasies, is what I'm trying to say. They were a new thing. They were a new series. Good in their own ways, bad in their own ways. And yeah, for better or for worse, some people enjoyed them, some people didn't. A lot of opinions are very divisive about that, and in all honesty, I hope that people who want to comment on everything I've just said in the comments, as I know some of you do like to do, can do so with at least a civil air. I've seen several discussions that have been done rather well worded, well decided, and with a lot of tact, I guess is the word I'm looking for, which I like. I like people discussing, I've heard people tell me FF7 is the worst game ever. Okay, well, why is that? Oh, discuss. FF9 was the end of an era, and a lot of weight was put upon it. And my point in bringing forward all of that comment about the Star Trek thing is that you can really feel the passion for that era in FF9. You can tell that they really went the whole 9 yards or whatever. They really, really pushed to put forth their very best in this, their last hurrah of an age of gaming. And they knew it was going to be the end of this age. And they did a very excellent job, in my opinion. There's a reason it's one of my favorites. There's a reason I call FF9 art, in my opinion. Now, there are some very serious flaws in FF9. I'm sorry, it's rather warm in here. AC's being weird again. No, that's not why I don't have my shirt on, for anyone who's curious. FF9 did have some serious flaws. I'm going to discuss those as I go, and I'm going to try and talk about the game in its structure terms. Because, as I mentioned back in FF8, one of FF8's strongest points was the story, with the one exception, with the one, the orphanage basketball scene, whatever you want to call that. With that one exception, that whole story was very well constructed, very well paced, very well executed, right? FF9 sort of had an opposite problem. FF9's story was more engaging, more emotional, more personally connected, and yet much more poorly executed and had some rather serious logical flaws to it. I'll get to that in a minute. I just wanted to mention that here. Let's go ahead and talk about game mechanics here, shall we? Actually, let's talk about one other thing first, before we get into mechanics or story. There's something interesting about FF9. FF9 had a very strange marketing thing. In fact, it was the first FF to truly have what most people would refer to as a marketing campaign behind it. Yes, they had marketed previous games, including 7, of course, but 9 was very well advertised, had a good, nice, large marketing budget, and they had, the Coke commercial, for goodness sakes. What else do I have to say about that? And the action figures and all that fun stuff. That whole market had really started to explode. Whether that is a good or a bad thing is not something I'm commenting on. What I am saying is that even if you were not an FF fan, by 9, you probably were aware of the series because of 9. And now, granted, 7 is the real cause of this. As I've said before, 7 was the exploder, the financial boom story of the FF series, and I don't dispute that now or then. But 9 was one that was so well publicized that most people were aware of it to some extent or another. 9 also had a very horribly flawed and failed attempt at making its own online wiki. And I say that, I guess I should lie, because I'm saying that incorrectly. See, what happened is the Prima strategy guide, I believe it was Prima, came out with the FF9 strategy guide, and it was garbage, and it was junk, and it was horrible. Not only was it relatively misinformative and had some incorrect information in it, but on several points it would say, if you want to know more about this, go to this website. And that's where the FF9, wiki was up. We didn't call them, well, we had just started calling that term wikis back in that point in time. This is over a decade ago at this point. But that was, the whole GameFAQs thing, the whole online strategy website congregate thing. That's kind of where they were going with that, and this was one of the earlier games to support its own. And the site itself was fine, a little bit difficult to navigate, but the fact that the strategy guide, which people would pay good money for, told them in many occasions, as anyone who had it could attest to, go check this out on the site rather than actually seeing it in this guide you just paid for, was aggravating and really did not help the publicity of the game, as many of the people who actually bought the strategy guide, I was not among that list, by the way, and in case anyone's curious, but I did know several friends who were rather irate, and for good reason. I don't blame them in the slightest. FF9 was also the first game of the FF series that I personally had to stand in line to buy when it came out. Not the last, but FF7 I grabbed from a... I don't even remember the store. Just grabbed it, picked it up, no problem. FF8, yep, no issue. FF9, there was a line coming out of the store and going out down the block just a little bit for FF9. That was the first time I'd seen that. So, just trying to get the point across that by this point the Final Fantasy series had changed, even regardless of this game specifically. It's kind of the same process the MMOs went under, if you look at them, and video games as a whole have gone under. Video games used to be, the hidden thing, the weird, the thing that weird people did. Nowadays, they're so popularized, you would be hard pressed to find someone on the street who does not play video games to some extent or another. And FF Final Fantasy, even amongst other video game people, tended to be the video game players to video game players as video game players are to normal people thing. The FF people were over in the corner. FF9 was when all of that had, for the first time, truly was considered more accepted and more open. And it was interesting because so many people have such strong opinions about 9, both for and against, and I think one of the reasons why is because it hit such a wider market when it came out, because so many people had FF9 as their first, I shouldn't say so many people, but a decent chunk of people had FF9 as their first real exposure to the series. People who were not gamers, like us. People who were just people. So I just wanted to discuss that, I believe, because it is interesting when you consider the plight of FF9. Because again, this is a game designed to be an homage, to be a celebration of the series and everything we loved about it. And I actually made a note here to talk about the illusions in the game. I'm going to talk about that right now. Allusions, by the way, in case I was mispronouncing, not illusions. There were dozens, in fact there were hundreds actually, of allusions within the game. In fact, there's a list of them on the Final Fantasy Wiki about just how many there are, and I was just kind of browsing down the site just last night when I was preparing for this review and just looking at them like, oh my goodness, because there are a few even I missed. And that's kind of the point, is so many of these were done not just to be like cameos, but to actually kind of thread in so much of the series into the game so that everyone so they could create those little smiles. That's what I call that. It's not something you're like, yeah, it's so cool, and it's not something we're like, oh, this is so dumb. And it's not, one of those things where it's just like, yeah, okay, it's a cameo. The idea was to have this one little, and a lot of them were very little, very, very small little illusions, very small little moments, and you just look at them, you just kind of grin a bit, just be like, oh, that's cool. A lot of them are kind of obvious. Most of them were not, actually. But I thought that was really well done, and I did like the fact that they did that and showed off so much of the classic FF. I'm of course ignoring the biggest thing, which is the return to the super deformed graphics. I'm going to go ahead and talk about graphics next here. Speaking of which. But the return to the super deformed format actually worked really well, I thought, because they had finally hammered out all their problems with the animation. The characters actually did animate and flowed beautifully. They felt a lot more alive than the stick figure problem, the Uncanny Valley problem we had back in FF8. And even though they would truly fix that finally in FF10 and have actual, people with realistic proportions and proper animations, FF9 was an extremely good step forward, and in frankness, a bit of a breath of fresh air graphics-wise and animation-wise from FF8. It is also worth noting FF9 is absolutely gorgeous. They really went above and beyond to really flesh out the backgrounds of FF9. The city, Lindblom by itself, every time I go there, I'm just like, oh my god, and just looking in the background, and the scenic vistas, and the forest, and everywhere. I could just summarize every single spot, every location in the game was beautifully rendered, beautifully designed. I never had that weird feeling. I never had that, no, that's a little off feeling like I did in both 8 and 7 at certain points. No, they figured out what they were doing with that, and they pulled it off, and they pulled it off beautifully. And one other thing I feel like mentioning right here as an aside, because this is a strangeness to me. Of all the Final Fantasies I've played, one of the things I always like is having my spells look cool. And I mean that. I do like having my spells look cool. I do like having the fact that Holy goes and Flare goes and Nuke goes but slightly differently. And Ultima is of course. Yes, that's right. That's the sound effect for Ultima. Anyways, I'm a geek. And I really like my spells looking cool. FF9 by far is the coolest looking spells of the entire FF series in my opinion. Obviously the graphics were not there to some of the later ones like 10 or 12 or 13, but the design of them and the way they presented them was extremely cool. It's worth noting that in FF9 even cures and basic things like Fire 2 and whatnot were very cool looking, and you could tell that the graphics department really put forth their best foot in order to try and make those art pieces, for lack of a better term, look extremely awesome, and I love that about 9. In FF9, melees are usually stronger than mages, right? Depending on how you're playing, but usually that's how it kind of ends up for me. I nevertheless usually have people who are casting constantly. I have Vivi and Aiko or Garnet in my party, so I can see the animations, just because it's so cool to be like, all right, holy, bam, and it just looks so cool. What can I say? I'm a fan of cool every now and again, within moderation. But then again, I am a huge fan of Devil May Cry 3, not 2, 3. And so, if you're really listening, if you're really paying attention, that's one of the things I'm trying to get across, is that the team that made FF9, with regards to everything, really did put forward their best feat. They really, made the effort in every respect. Now, speaking of that, let's go ahead and segue a little bit here. The graphics, yes, amazing. There was a lot of cool factor. The music was very strange, and I've been kind of leading up to this point as I've been doing FF7 and FF8's review. FF9 was the last game that Nobuo Uematsu actually did in its entirety. He did the whole game, and the reasoning being is actually really simple. Nobuo Uematsu was getting burnt out, and kind of obviously, the man was doing entire game soundtracks by himself within a fairly short amount of time, because they were really cranking these out. And so 9 was the one where he said, this is getting ridiculous. This is getting silly. I'm getting worn out. I'm getting beat up. This can't keep happening like this, okay? So, I need a break. And so he pulled back his role and eventually ended up being just basically what is amounted to a consultant. And good on him. I'm really with that. But the reason I've been building this up this whole time is, if you go back to, say, FF6, I can't look at any FF6 song that I don't like to listen to on its own right. If I go to FF7, there are some songs I don't like to listen to just because they're good songs, but they do fit the scenes. Then I get to FF8, and then the dissonance really starts to gather. And then we get to FF9, and it starts to get really apparent that there was a genuine problem with the poor man, and with all the work that he was having to do in order to keep up with this. And you can tell that he was really rushing. That being said, there were some truly excellent songs in FF9, and one of the things he did was he pulled what I like to call a John Williams, where he took a main tune, and he wove that tune into a lot. Almost every song, every major song, every song that plays during every major event and whatnot like that, has this tune, the melody of life tune going through it. And I actually thought that really worked out well because of the whole strength of the theme of the game of FF9. Now, along lines with that, one of the things that I truly enjoy about FF9 is the fact that, how do I put this? I think I already said this before, but this really deserves to be re-emphasized. FF9 was the last Final Fantasy. In my completely honest opinion, if they had just started with a new series and not held to the expectations of the Final Fantasy series, if they had tried to keep going with a fresh outlook, a new formula, a new model, something like that, and that was FF10 and on, I think that would have worked. Because that's kind of what they did do if you really think about it. They're clinging to the FF name without a lot of reason to do so. FF9, in my opinion, was the last Final Fantasy. Not saying FF10 and 12 and 13 aren't good in their own rights, or great, as the case may be, but they really weren't Final Fantasies, and I think that's one of those tripping points that keeps coming up. They keep thinking name brand. I've never understood this. I talked about this in one of my very first videos, way back, like over a year ago at this point. Name, just because you slap a name brand onto something does not make it good, or bad for that matter. It means nothing. It means nothing on its own rights. A game, especially something as incredibly complicated as a game, is good or bad on its own merits, not because it has Final Fantasy in front of it. Pardon me a moment. Now, let's go ahead and talk about mechanics first, shall we here? Let's go ahead and really get into this. One of the things FF9 did really poorly was how they handled the limit break system. As I've mentioned before, limit breaks, which is the most commonly accepted generic term, in case anyone wonders why I'm calling it that, have existed since Final Fantasy VI, where they were the desperation maneuvers. In FF9, the limit breaks effectively worked like they did in FF7 with a couple of really big problems. You would learn new abilities while in limit break form, tranced actually, as time went on, either through plot points or through equipment based on what weapons you had equipped, or actually I guess that's it, I'm sorry, there's no or there. And here's the catch. In FF7, you select a limit break and you're like, yeah, limit break, pwah. In FF8, you select limit break and you're like, pwah. In FF9, the moment you hit limit break, you trance. Now, I know I'm not the only one who's had this happen to me. Let's say I'm fighting this big boss, or no, I'm fighting a bunch of trash mobs, and I'm about to kill the last trash mob, and the trash mob hits me with a retaliatory attack, and it's just enough to push me over to a trance. So I go through the whole trance animation, victory music, da 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 na 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 da na, and then the trance is wasted. There's a twofold flaw here. One, trance only lasts for the battle it's in. Once you have tranced, one way or another, by the time the battle is ended, your bar is reset, and you're out. Okay. Problem two, you have to trance, as I just demonstrated. There is no selection. The moment your bar fills, you trance. Period. Just like that. This is something they'd never done before, and indeed never since, for good reason. You could argue a couple exceptions, but in general they haven't done that ever since. And those two flaws both created a system that was basically more of an annoyance than anything else. It's also worth noting that a lot of the trances were actually worse in some ways. I'll give you a good example. Freya's. The jump, turning into staying up there and flinging swords down. No, I would prefer to have jump, please. Can I have my jump back? So trance was actually really poorly implemented, to be completely honest about it. It's a shame, it's a pity, but the reality of it is right there. Trance didn't work. It might as well not have even existed. Now, here's the funny part. I'm going to go ahead and diverge. I know I like to talk about mechanics then lore. This is kind of lore-related. In FF6, the desperation maneuvers were there purely as a mechanic. In FF7, limit breaks were acknowledged within the setting, but that was it. In FF8, they went back to pure mechanic. In FF9, they decided to take the summoning creature route. Ever since Final Fantasy IV, the summons have been intricately tied into the plot, and indeed they are in 9 as well. But what they decided to do was to say, okay, let's take these limit breaks, which is a feature we've been using for several games now, and make them part of the plot. And indeed, trance is an integral part of the story. which is very strange in its own right, because when trance works in story sense, in story terms, it's actually worked great. Every time a trance goes off because of a plot device, or because it's happening in a cutscene, or and someone who isn't you, like Mog, spoiler alert, or Kuja, spoiler alert, whenever they go trance, it makes perfect sense, and it works exactly how it theoretically should for you, the player. It's just not like that way in mechanics way. So somebody dropped the ball somewhere on that. Not really sure who to turn onto on that one. Um, One of the other things, mechanics-wise, they did that was very interesting. They've been experimenting with ways to customize your characters ever since FF5, ever since FF1 technically, but you know what I mean. 5 is where they really started getting the ball rolling on that one. And one of the things they had tried before was having items that teach you abilities. That was Magicite back in 6. And then they tried items that teach themselves abilities that you can equip, so you have the abilities of whatever you have equipped. And then they tried attaching an ability to you via junctioning. The way they did this here is very strange, and yet I actually do like, believe it or not, and for a very, very stupid reason. In FF9, you equip a gauntlet, and this gauntlet will teach you something, cure. What it will teach depends on the individual, and everyone can only equip so many items, just like most FFs are like, that's the standard, actually. And so the items themselves will teach you abilities based on the AP you get and how long you have them equipped, but once you have it teached, it's taught forever, right? The reason this is interesting is, I don't know about you, but since FF9 is a game that doesn't require level grind, it also doesn't require AP grind unless you want to. And so there's a system of kind of actively encouraging you to not sell off all your old gear, because you might still have stuff you could learn from it. And for me, it added additional challenge modes, sort of. It wasn't a full challenge like, the ones I've discussed before in previous reviews, but it was more like, I don't unequip a weapon. I go down the list is what I'm saying. Let's say I start off with the basic dagger, right? And I get 5 daggers by the time I complete maxing that dagger. And those daggers are stacked. This is the order of power. This is the strongest, and it's like that. It's very linear, right? So I then equip the second dagger until it's done, and then I equip the third dagger until it's done training, and so forth and so on. So I limit myself in terms of gear based on what I've learned. And like I said, you will learn much, much slower than you will get gear. And so it presented an interesting in-game challenge feature that I actually really did enjoy personally. And of course, if you don't want to deal with it, you don't have to, because frankly, aside from a lot of the passive abilities, the abilities aren't all that required in order to beat the game, because FF9 is not that difficult of a game, all things considered. Not that I think it's a bad thing. Now, like I said, I do think that is a bit of a positive. And by the way, if it's not obvious, for various reasons, this is going to be a little bit shorter of a review than I thought it was going to be initially. So I apologize. It's a shame, because the game deserves so much to talk about. But anyways, minigames, okay? Minigames in FF9, they really started doing the minigame thing for real in FF7. That's when, the Golden Saucer and all the different sides quests, that's when it really became minigames. Anything before that was optional stuff that really doesn't qualify as a minigame, in my opinion. FF9 also had minigames, and unfortunately made them kind of bad, to be completely honest with you. The running around the globe, I don't actually remember what it was called. The chocograph, I think it was the chocograph thing, actually. The chocograph thing I actually liked. I liked it because it encourages a particular type of exploration. What it is, for anybody who's not familiar with it, is it will give you an image of somewhere on the world. And when I say an image, I mean literally like, this, if you were standing here, this is what you'd be seeing, right? There's this hill, and here's this beach, and here's the pattern of the trees, stuff like that. And you would then be tasked to go find that spot and dig there, and you'd find the treasure, right? I thought that was really cool. And, obviously I have a good visual memory, so I was cool with that. But I did actually enjoy roaming the world with my chocobo and trying to find all this stuff. Now, it is unfortunate that that is also tethered with the other minigame, which I loathed. I do not know how to put into words how much I hated that stupid, freaking digging minigame in the little zones, dig up, get points, upgrade your thing. Every once in a blue freaking moon, you get the item you actually want. It was incredibly grindy. It was incredibly luck-based. It was incredibly boring. It was literally hot cold. I guess is the name of the game. Hot. If you peck here, you're far away. It'll be like queh. And you get a little closer. Oh, queh queh. Oh, you're right on it. Queh queh queh. It was a cold hot game. You see what I'm saying? Cold hot 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 hot. Which is not a very fun game. if I'm honest, and certainly not something that you should have forced on the player more than maybe 10 times max. Instead, what you had to do, if you really wanted to enjoy that game, if you really wanted to unlock, the Chocobo Heaven and attack Ozma and do all the optional stuff, is do that, anywhere from 50 to 90 times per zone. And it got really, really old. I actually had to start muting my damn TV because of how sick I was of that damned song. And I hated it. I hated every moment. I've only done it once. To date, only one of the playthroughs I've done of FF9 has been done that minigame because of how tedious and how and poorly designed it was. If you're going to do something like that, you either need to have a graphic representation, you need to fix it because it had several bugs. I hope I'm not waking anybody up. It is a little late. This is why I'm trying to talk a little quietly, by the way, if nobody's caught that on. It did have a few bugs. Occasionally you'd have a spot that was basically only capable of getting if your Chocobo was tilted in a certain angle on a certain spot, and if you did it just wrong, you would miss it completely and blah blah blah. And the whole thing felt like padding. The point of a minigame should be one of two things, or both. Both is also possible. And this is, of course, just my opinion. A minigame should be fun, and it should be some way to obtain something that the player wants, Chocobo racing in FF7 is a great example. Now, I do find Chocobo racing fun in FF7, but even people I know who didn't find it fun nevertheless did it because the rewards were worth it. In FF9, the rewards are not worth it. It's basically for completion's sake and to go after the optional super boss. Yes, I know you do get actual rewards, but who cares, for lack of a better way to put it. And the game itself was not fun. There was no challenge, there was no engagement, there was nothing to do but play hot, cold, over and over and over, with a timer. I don't know if I mentioned that. There's a timer involved, too, so you're playing hot, cold while stressed, and while hating it. So, yeah. Now, there were a few other mini-games in FF9, and those actually did succeed much better. I like the card game in FF9. It was a lot simpler than the one in FF8, which I only mentioned in brief. I wanted to talk about both card games in general here, actually. Both of those card games were actually playable as real games in Japan. I'm not actually sure that ever came out anywhere else. I could be wrong about that. Not sure. But I do know they actually made a standalone game. That's just the card game. But in FF8, the card game was an actual card game, if you understand what I mean. There was actual complexity to it. There was actual strategy to it. In FF9, for whatever reason, they decided to simplify it. Now, I still enjoy it. I'll go out on record. I still enjoy playing the card game in FF9, but not nearly as much as in FF8. In FF9, it's like playing rock, paper, scissors almost. It really is. Do you have cards that can beat his cards? Yes. Okay, well then you win. Congratulations, you have won. If you have cards that cannot beat his cards, oh well then you lose. In FF8, there was a lot more tactics involved, there was a lot more strategy involved, and there was a lot more reward involved. In fact, there was a reward involved. You could turn cards into items, which you could turn into other items, part of the crafting mechanic in FF8. In FF9, you can get points in order to see one additional scene with cutscene with Gilgamesh, and you have to do it at one point as part of the plot. Now, the plot point I'm okay with, in all honesty. Making us do 3 card games, not a big deal. But my point is, both the hot-cold game, the digging chocobo game, and the card game felt vestigial. It felt like they didn't have to be there. It felt like they didn't actually add anything to the game, if you know what I'm saying. And I found that to be discouraging and unfortunate. In all honesty, if they removed both, I barely would have even noticed. I like the chocograph, though. I do. I like that exploration little game. That was fun. Let's talk about ATE. I loved the ATE system. It was something they'd never really done before. RPGs since forever. Well, since 4, actually. FF4 was one of the first to do this. Have had the cutaway thing, You have just beaten this boss, and then it goes bzzz, and then there's usually a little thing. Meanwhile, elsewhere, bzzz, and you see another cutscene somewhere else, right? What they did with ATE was, A, made it optional, Okay, yeah, I like that. I'm with that. I obviously always watched it, but the fact that it is optional is a good thing. Not everyone wants to watch it every time, right? And B, they allowed with an actual system in play to do that, with an actual mechanic in play, they could do a lot more with it, as indeed they did in FF9 for the first half of the game. Later on, ATEs just kind of stopped happening, but we're not talking about that. The point is that, for anyone who doesn't know, active time event is what it stands for. And it was basically, if you're walking through town, you could see this little pop-up. Some of them were tuned to events. Some of them were tuned to time. Some of them were tuned to, what level you were. There are all sorts of variables that could prompt ATEs to happen. And you could click it, and all you would see is this other little cutscene going on over here. Sometimes it was somewhere you'd just been. Sometimes it was on the other side of the planet. Sometimes it was, someone else in your team who's like 2 rooms away, But it added more scenes. It added more cutscenes. It added to the feel that I'm going to get. This is the thing I'm going to basically talk about last. It added to the feel of this being a world you're living in rather than just a story you're participating in, if that makes any sense. And I'll discuss that more in later. But the summary here is I did like the ATE system, and I do think that was a good idea on the behalf of Square, and I actually wouldn't mind them doing that again. Obviously they haven't. Shame. But, there's one other minigame. I'm sorry, I actually meant to talk about this last. It's called Mognet. Now, I actually liked Mognet. Mognet was actually kind of uninvolved, but that worked in its favor. It never got boring, it never got dull, it never got tedious, and there was so little to it that you could accomplish it with relative ease. And Mognet was an in-game way of you get these little letters, and you could read these little letters, and it would be like, hey, here's what's going on, and you can act as a mail carrier yourself to help Mognet keep going. And eventually you'd reach a point where you'd go back and actually fix Mognet, because Artemisian, or whatever her name was using all the goop to make her fur look really shiny. But I liked that. I liked that system of having this rather casual way of adding just a little bit of flavor to the game. Zelda Twilight Princess did this as well with the mail. Obviously, there were some mails that were, pertinent. Hey, I've got a new bomb. Hey, oh, pardon me. Hey, I need this thing dealt with, but a lot of them were just, hey, I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing, and blah, blah, blah. Allow me to give you another example of something I like about this system. Both Tor and Guild Wars 2 have a system where NPCs, whose quests you've completed, will send you a message. And it's usually just a little bit of flavor, but that's the point. Flavor, if I haven't made this absolutely clear, flavor, when done right, and it usually is, adds so much to a game. The more bare bones a game gets, to me, the more boring it gets. The more you bear it down to just the base mechanics, the less interested I am. I want you to build it up. I want you to add to it. If you give me a raw steak that is uncooked and unseasoned and anything, literally just a raw slab of meat, yes, it's edible, but I'm not really going to enjoy it, am I? The more you add to it, the more you flavor it, the more I'm going to enjoy it. And adding just and flavor is always done. The reason I call it flavor is because it really is just little sprinklings of cinnamon or seasoning or what, obviously cinnamon, not in the case of steak, but you get the idea, right? Just little tidbits, and that's what that added. It added just that extra little bit, and I really liked that. That and the AT system both really helped flesh out the game, and they were both mechanics that were used to help the story, which is what, in my opinion, a mechanic should be, and indeed vice versa. There should be a blend of gameplay and story integration rather than just. So I like that. Now, what do we got here? Let's go ahead and talk about the story. Let's go and talk about the plot. FF9 has one of the more complicated plots amongst the FF series. Now, part of this is at the fault of the developers. And let me step back a little bit here. For a long time, several people did not know the plot of FF9. I mean, obviously the basics are there. We get the base point of what's happening now, but the background and the implications that were there from whatever happened before and whatever happened to the people of Terra and what exactly Garland was trying to, all that fun stuff. We had no idea. It wasn't until Ultimania came out with a guide, literally discussing the plot in an absolute format. No hinting, no alluding, just laying it out. This is what the plot was, that it became clear, and I freely admit that I am in that category. FF9's plot was very complicated. I like that. The problem is you need to show that in the game. I shouldn't have to read a book in order to get all the details you left out. Remember I was talking back in I don't remember which review. One of these FF reviews, I was talking about um, using impressions. I think I was talking about an FF1 actually. Giving just bits and pieces of a story or of a setting and letting you fill in the gaps in order to make up for the lack, right? In order to make up for the lack of technology and time and money and all that fun stuff, and to help accent the experience so that when you play it, you enjoy it more because you are filling in most of those blanks with your story, the story that you actually would like to see there, if you see what I'm saying here. And it tends to work rather well when done properly. But as I mentioned back then, whenever I mentioned it last, FF9 is the game that finally went too far. FF9 left too much to the imagination. It is possible to go too far the other way. There were too many details, too many pieces of information that should have been shared in the game and not hinted at, and not mentioned, and not implied. They should have actually detailed more of the story, of the plot, of the background of FF9, because it was a very complicated plot, and even if it, honestly, even if it wasn't a complicated plot, you need to have at least a chunk of the story there. In my opinion, you need to have at least a portion of it flat and straight, and not implicated. So that was one of the biggest problems. That is actually the biggest problem with FF9's story. I know one friend personally who, until he started talking to me about the series, FF9 was his least favorite of the Final Fantasies. And the reason why was because he got pissed off at how teasing the story was. I believe that's the word that we used. Because the story kept teasing you. It kept being like, oh, we're going to give more information. We're going to tell you what's going on. No. Hang on, here's another mystery. Okay, more information. The X-Files syndrome, if I could be honest about it. Hey, we're gonna actually explain what. No, we're not actually gonna explain what's going on. Here's another mystery for you to chew on for a bit. Oh, wait, we're gonna reveal one thing. Yep, here's the truth about Zidane. Now think about it. No, we're still not actually explaining anything. Sorry. And it bothered him, and I don't actually blame him on that. And when I sat down and told him the story, based on the Ultimania and based on what was actually in the game, he was like, "Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Why didn't they say that in the game?" The point I'm trying to get to is if your plot requires a level of tolerance or interest that is not engendered within the plot, then that plot has failed. Now, that being said, like I said, FF8 had a very well-structured plot. FF7 had a very well-designed plot and executed plot, and FF6 had a very emotional, very, very heartfelt plot, and so did FF4. FF9 had an extremely convoluted plot and didn't actually execute it well. However, there is one thing FF9 did very well with regards to that, which I'm actually going to go ahead and talk about now. It's the theme. As I mentioned, the theme of an FF became something of a crutch in later games, and FF9 was one of the first, actually the second game really, where that really began to be felt. The obvious theme of FF9 is the theme of life. Melodies of life, the crystal of life, blah, 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 blah. But there's not really much for me to talk about there. The theme of life, the theme of concept, the theme of continuance, of perseverance, that kind of thing, was rather obvious. It was actually a little too obvious, if I might be honest. There was a lot of usage of both death and birth, literal and otherwise, in order to emphasize that theme throughout the movie, or throughout the game. I will go out on a limb and say that I do like how they wove that theme into everything. Conceptually speaking, I guess I should say, because every game previous, they hadn't really adhered to that as a rule, as a law. They never said, the theme has to be dominating everything in the whole game. FF9 was the first one where the theme really did dominate everything. There is one other theme, though, to FF9. It's an interesting theme. It's really the last game that had a secondary theme, in my opinion, because FF10 had a very, solid one theme. FF12 had a very solid one theme. FF13 had a very, very narrow-minded one theme here. But FF9 actually did have two themes to it. There's the obvious theme of life, which is most powerfully exemplified, and I like this as well because FF6 did this too, in its villain. And I'll talk about that more in detail later, but just to summarize really quick, FF9 showed through contrast and in layers of perspective. I'll go ahead and talk about this now. In layers of perspective, let's take the Black Mages, right? They are literally golems, created from discarded souls that were kicked out as a byproduct of the process of taking over the planet, right? It's a convoluted game. What do you want? But the point is, they're golems who are alive, but have a artificial deadline at which they will stop, and they have a very artificial form of life because they were never designed to be a species. They were designed to be a tool, and yet they were created out of dead souls, or rather discarded souls. And so what we had there is something that did actually have a spark of life in it, even though it was never intended to be. It's very tragic, actually. It's actually really, really well done tragedy. And so we see creatures that are so artificial and so desperate to live, and are doing it in... It's a classic... I'd say it's a classic Pinocchio story, but I prefer to call it a Data story from Star Trek Next Generation. Whenever Data was written properly in his attempts to emulate humanity and emotion and all that fun stuff, it came off very well. And there's a degree of tragedy and a degree of interest into that type of storyline. And they pulled it off extremely well with the entire Black Mage race, especially Vivi, the prototype. You know, every single one of them did very much give a feeling of almost childlike innocence and a lack of knowledge, really, a lack of experience, because they still felt, they still were, but they didn't know that, and they didn't know how to express it. And there's this wonderful scene way late in the game where the genomes are brought back to the world and left at the Black Mage village, and the genomes know less than the Black Mages. The Black Mages have at least had some experiences, a few months or years of experience in living and you know, growing and cooking and all these fun things that people do. The genomes knew nothing. And so it was this wonderful scene of... It really demonstrates how well they built up the Black Mages as a race, because they were introduced initially as the broken puppets. You know, the puppets that would be people, you know, the Pinocchio thing again, right? But by the end of the game, you get there, they have successfully grown, they have successfully nurtured just enough that they can then help the genomes, who have had no growth whatsoever, in order to acclimate and to life. And again, that's my whole point of all this. Different layers of perspective. That's why I say it that way. It's different people's, different beings, different species perspectives of life. We don't just see life as this one wonderful grand thing, which, you know, that's great and all, but we see the Black Mage's perspective of life, we see the genome's perspective of life, we see the human's perspective of life, we see the main character's perspective of life. You know, we see so many different viewpoints of what life is, and what we find throughout this course of the game is that life depends on the individual, really. What life is depends on the individual's perspective. It depends on the individual's opinions. And I thought that was extremely well done. I thought that was extremely well constructed and beautifully executed. And it's funny that I'm saying this, because I was just saying, you know, the plot, the story, was really bad in FF9. That's why FF9 is so freaking strange. I know I'm kind of going all over the place with the plot and the story. Let me really lay this out right now, okay? The plot of FF9 is alright. It failed. It poorly executed, but it is alright. It is interesting enough to keep engaging. I don't replay FF9 for the plot. I replay FF9 because what it does is it shows us a world. I'll get more into that later, and that's going to be one of my final points. But as weird as this is going to sound, the plot almost doesn't matter to FF9. Yes, it drives events. Yes, it pushes people, you know, none of these people would have ever interacted with each other if the plot wasn't happening. None of these events would have come to pass if the plot wasn't happening. But for the purpose of enjoying the game, and enjoying the setting, and enjoying the characters, and enjoying the world, the plot is irrelevant, if you see what I'm saying here. And this is kind of what I'm talking about here, with the way these are completely nameless. Well, not all of them are nameless, but, you know, these are NPCs who have extremely little to do with the plot. Yes, they have something to do with the plot, but not much. And they received, these completely nameless, well, mostly nameless NPCs received enough characterization to have actually had character growth throughout the course of the game. That's what I'm talking about, and that's one of the reasons I say that they did actually succeed with FF9, where something like FF8 failed, where FF8 had a very good plot, and a very well-structured plot, and a very well-developed plot. The growth of the individuals and the characters involved within was very negligible by contrast. and the focus was much more clearly on the story rather than the people, if you see what I'm saying here. Not that I'm saying either is better or worse than the other, by the way. I'm just trying to compare and contrast, because FF8 and FF9 really are very, very different types of games. But let's go ahead and get to the second theme. I've been dancing around this for a bit. Memory. One of the biggest themes of FF9 is memory, and obviously this is very literal because they have the idea that we introduced in the last dungeon that memory is able to be passed along through the souls or hearts or whatever of other people and blah, blah, blah. That's not actually what I'm talking about. Obviously that's part of it. But one of the biggest things that the game tries to postulate through, again, the perspectives of several people, is how important memory is, how important it is to remember what you've been through and how you've gone through it and what is past, and how much that changes you. How much we as living beings alter who and what we are because of our memories and because of what we've been through and because of our reflection upon those things, and indeed whether or not we choose to learn from them and grow from them and adapt from them, or if we choose not to. FF9 explores both as well. There are individuals in this game who take heart, for lack of a better way to put it. They look back at what they've seen, they look back at their memories, and they say, I can do better, I can fix it. And then there are individuals who don't, who say, that no, I'm not changing, I'm not altering, this is the correct path, it always was the correct path, I just need to do it properly this time. And I'm not saying either one is good or evil or bad or right or wrong. It's just interesting to watch that in contrast. And when I'm saying individuals, I'm talking, again, all the way down to the NPC level. So much characterization in this game. Let's go ahead and move on, though, really quick here to romance. I've mentioned romance in several of the FFs to some extent or another, because as I've said before, a romance in a video game needs to be done very carefully. It really does. I thought FF6 basically did romance perfectly with Celis and Locke. I think FF7 did it very well with Tifa and Cloud. I think FF8 kind of fumbled on it, to be completely honest with you. But it is worth noting that, at the very least, well, no, see, I want to give FF8 some credit, but the truth of the matter is I think having the romance option there as such a focus of 8 was a mistake. In FF9, we have a unique situation in which... How do I put this? In FF8, we saw romance from a teenager's perspective, right? You know, Squall was, for all intents and purposes, a kid. He was a youngin', and the romance between him and Renoa did develop as a romance between two children. Sorry, I feel old sometimes. Two teenagers should. That made perfect sense, right? And it's one of the reasons I don't bash it as much as I otherwise would, because it was kind of... But in FF9, we have a young princess who has never experienced anything outside of her life in the castle other than her bad memories, who is actually a summoner secretly, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And this is really such a convoluted game. We have a young princess who is actually not actually the princess, but she was adopted because she looks like it. But she's actually a summoner who is one of the only three survivors, I guess, of the catastrophe that was created in order to kill all the summoners off. And then on the other side, we have a young man who has been growing up in a thief/performance troupe, who has been endeavoring to make ends meet in their own little Robin Hood-y sort of way, and at the same time also consequently is a angel of death who is created to go to this planet and reap as much death as possible in order to allow the souls to be processed so that the planet can be taken over literally from the inside out. That's FF9, as far as the convolution there. But Garnet, or whatever her real name is, I don't remember, and Zidane did have a degree of chemistry to them. They actually did. You did see more of Zidane as a person rather than a lecherous, git. And you did see Garnet as someone who was not an uppity snob whenever they were together. The problem is, somewhere along the line, it feels like the writers changed. Because for the first half of the game, those two dancing around each other and slowly circling worked, I thought. I thought it actually worked really well. And then it just kind of started doing this, and plummeting downhill. There's a scene in particular I'm thinking of where Zidane is bemoaning the loss of Garnet, and he's like, He's literally moping. And he's like, and he says the dumbest lines. How can I live without her? How can I start my day without her? Now, don't mistake me. I do understand what it's like to be infatuated and or indeed in love. Obviously, I suppose. But I'm trying to think how to put this properly. I apologize for the pause here. It came off as fake, is the word I want to use. It came off as though it was artificial. We understand Zidane misses Garnet. We understand that he wants to be with her. We understand that he is, as most young, or at least new lovers or romanticers or whatever you want to call it are, he was very awkward. He was very timid, I guess is the word I'm looking for here. So he didn't want to just walk up and say, "Hey, Garnet, you're awesome." And he didn't want to embellish upon that. And yet, it felt like they were... here's the word I'm going... Okay. It felt like they were trying to create drama for no damn reason. You know, drama for its own sake. Now, I'm admittedly of an opinion on this, but I don't like drama. Not in real life, not in my games, not in my shows, not in my movies, not in my books. I do not like drama. And you know what I'm talking about when I say that, right? You know, I'm not talking about, drama is in the literal sense of the term, or the theatrical sense, or the literary sense. I'm talking drama. And I don't even know how to better explain that. And that's what it felt like it was doing. It was trying to artificially create drama when, A, drama is never needed, and B, it really wasn't needed for that situation. And it's worth noting that it dropped almost immediately. Within 2 scenes, the plot kicks up again and they start doing stuff again, What? And so it felt so out of place. But then for the rest of the game, they do actually stay together friendly enough, after she loses her voice, and he does actually take care of her in a properly protective, I guess is the word I'm looking for, manner that it worked. And when they finally get together, literally at the end of the game, I actually liked that. I thought so. It's really weird, It was like, okay, I'm okay with it. I'm not okay with it. I'm okay with it. I do think that having a romance being one of the primary focal points of character growth is not a good thing, personally. Yes, of course, a real romance in anything, especially in real life, will change a character, will change a person, will encourage growth. And that's why I have to say a real romance, because a bad romance will encourage stagnation. But anyways, moving on. Not that I just want to point out, I'm saying will encourage, not will make. There's a difference. But I do think that it would have been better served if they had focused on something else instead, because every character aside from those two, well, actually, really, every character aside from that's not true. Zidane did have interesting bits to his character and his character growth and his character arc that had nothing to do with Garnet. Garnet had interesting, that had nothing to do with Zidane. The romance feels so fake. I guess that's what I'm getting to. The romance between those two feels tacked on. It feels like it was added on for no damn reason. All I have to say is Bart and Lena, way back in FF5, had no romance. And it worked. They both cared about each other. They were both good friends. And in fact, they were both what I like to call more than friends, nakama. If I'm saying that right, I keep mispronouncing it, I'm sure. They were people who were bonded, who had been through things that other people can't understand. And they were together in a way that's difficult to emphasize. They were close, they were comrades. And they could have done that with Zidane and Garnet. I think that would have been a much better way of pulling that off. That's just me, though. Now, let's go and talk about the characters here, since I've kind of already started, and then I'll talk about my final few little bits here. I also have to pull up my list here now that I'm thinking about it. Characters. Let's go ahead and start with Zidane, Hey, why not? Zidane, like I said, his romance arc was unnecessary. His lecherous tendencies were obviously faked. He wasn't as bad as Irvine back in FF8, thank God. But he was more like FF6's Edgar, where he was lecherous, but ultimately he was only doing so every now and again, and it was mostly either for fun, because, hey, let's go have fun with life, or because he was faking it. In both cases, the character underneath was more. There was more there. Zidane is a genuinely good person. And before I start on the characters, one thing I really want to pull up here. I'm sorry, I'm not even sure I have the website up, so I'm going to have to find this really quick. But each of the characters has a quote that plays if you let it sit there during the intro. That is interesting because the way they were going with this is, here we are. They wanted to have these quotes not to define the characters, nor indeed to define the character arc. It was a fascinating approach from a writing perspective. In most works, you establish a character through the game, and then they have the establishment, the advancement, and the conclusion, the finale of their character arc, right? In FF9, for whatever reason, it did work, but for whatever reason, they decided to do things differently. They wanted to establish the character's start point right at the beginning. They wanted to say, this is where the character is when the game starts. And obviously they do flesh out the characters a little bit in their backstory, but ultimately they do almost nothing. All of the characters, you learn almost nothing about their past and what they've been through because that start point has already been established. The reason this works is because FF9, it allowed them to focus on the character growth for basically the entire game. Rather than having, for what I'm trying to get to here is virtually every scene that had a character in it, one of the main characters, one of the party members, serviced their growth as characters, serviced their growth as individuals, and that allowed them to make it slower and more gradual and smoother and better in general. And so we've got Zidane, virtue. You don't need a reason to help people. Bam, right there. That's his character arc at the start. That is who he is. And I like that quote. I actually used that quote myself. You don't need a reason to help people. It defines so much of what he is. Yes, he's a thief. Yes, he's a flirtatious person. But ultimately, he is the kind of guy who aspires to be what I call the Mario. I know I've used that term before. To be good as much as is possible, to the point of self-sacrificing without hesitation or question. And I like that. I like the way they had a unambiguously good main character. He is not flawless, not by a long shot, and he has his difficulties, he has his growth. But throughout the game, you see a young boy, for all intents and purposes, because he's not that old, who grows from being someone who just tries to do what he can, a very Han Solo type character, for all intents and purposes, the roaming, thieving, illegal type character who is nevertheless a good person, who nevertheless tries to help as he goes, as best as he's able. And he grows, and he learns a lot more responsibility, and he learns a lot more maturity as he goes. And he gets to the point where he understands, not only is he more mature because, that's what you do, but he has a real reason to be. Because in his view, he can help people more. He can aid, he can do more to help others if he is more responsible about it. And you really see that character growth as he goes through his arc. And indeed, he does have a complete breakdown, a mental breakdown at one point in the game. And it is worth noting that what breaks him out of it is his friends, the other party members, who remind him that as much as he has been striving, as much as he has been endeavoring to be there for them, for quite a while, they have been there for him as well. And I like this, because what that is this right here. I've shown this before in several of my videos. It's too easy to lean on someone and this person takes all of the weight, or vice versa. But what they were trying to emphasize was that they could lean on each other, was that they could rely on each other. And I really liked that. I really liked that message. I really liked how they executed that. I really liked Zidane's viewpoint of that, And to find out, I mean, honestly, I've heard some people call Zidane a wuss because, all he did was find out that he was actually a artificially manufactured demon thing who was designed to kill as many people as possible and happened to be pushed aside by the previous demon thing that was created for that purpose. I should call him Gollum rather than demon, but whatever. Yeah, I'm sorry. No, that would probably be quite a mental shock to the system for just about anyone. It's frankly amazing how quickly Zidane gets over it and becomes himself again, and indeed is more determined than ever before. Sorry, it's really uncomfortable sitting back here. It is also worth noting that Zidane's character arc in its entirety can be summarized by his second to last action before the ending, when, spoiler alert, they defeat Kuja, and Kuja basically, says thank you, or I don't remember his actual words, and Zidane realizes Kuja's still alive and goes to help him. That's Zidane in a nutshell. His brother, who has tried to murder him 20 times, tried to take over the world, tried to destroy the world, tried to destroy all worlds, is in trouble, and he goes to help him. You could say whatever you want about how foolish or stupid that is, and indeed it is. Let's not mistake ourselves. But that is Zidane in a nutshell, and I like that. So let's move on. What do we got in here? Vivi or Nitya. His quote is sorrow. How do you prove that you exist? Maybe we don't exist. Vivi is very much the tragic character of FF, which is very funny because most people, when they first saw the pictures of Vivi, he was one of the first characters announced for FF9. They assumed he was going to be the joke character. We've got, or the not the joke character, but the humor character. We had Mog back in FF. Well, we had Galoof back in FF5. We had Mog back in FF6. We had Yuffie basically in FF7. We had Selphie in FF8. Everyone assumed that was going to be Vivi. Vivi is actually very much a tragic figure. Very much, his quote there, right at the beginning, summarizes it all. How do you prove that you exist? Maybe we don't. And Vivi is very... I like Vivi a lot. Let's just put this way. His character growth is amazing. He goes through arguably the most growth of any of the characters in the game. He goes from being a very young, only a few months old, literally 6 months old actually, I'm staring at it right there. He goes from being a few months old, innocent, completely ignorant individual who is just trying to mimic life, because that's what he saw his master do, who was planning to eat him, which is kind of friggin' horrible if you really think about it. And he goes from that to being someone who sees others like himself, and then he sees the fact that they're automatons, and he realizes he is also probably that, and then he finds out individuals who are responsible, and then he starts to gain an appreciation for life. And it's funny, because before this we are revealed through basically the beginning, and of course through a bit of dialogue, that Vivi was trying to emulate life, right? He was actually putting forth the effort. He was actually, he was trying too hard, is actually what I'm getting for here. It is not until life happened to him. Zidane picked him up, the group picked him up, and he just kind of got swept along in this place of the plot. It wasn't until life happened to him, more or less accidentally, that he started understanding what life was. He started appreciating life. He started appreciating people. He started creating values all on his own. The growth happened on its own when he wasn't trying to. And then it reaches a point where he finally, and this is a beautiful character arc because it happens, and then there reaches a point in the game where he just kind of stops, because the plot has a very large pause point. Actually, there's a couple of them, but there's several really big pause points in FF9's game, and all of them exist to service this character growth, because at each point in time, in many games, if the plot never stops, if it's always a continuous pace throughout the game, what you have is the situation where if the characters have character growth, it's more or less enforced. What you have is something a little more subtle when you have a pause point in the actual story, in lore, because then a character literally has an opportunity to pause and think, and then things get complicated, and then things get interesting, and then things get emotional. Vivi is a beautiful example of that. Vivi has literally an existential crisis because he has a moment to stop and think about it. If the game had never had those pause points for him to actually have the availability to do that, I think it would have suffered, which is one of the reasons that I say, the plot is not the main purpose of the game, but it does nevertheless service the game, because the plot exists for the characters. And Vivi, dragging himself out of that essentially by force of sheer will, was actually very endearing to me, and earned a lot of respect for the character for me, in my opinion. I really did like the way he was presented as such. And again, as I said before earlier, the black mages to the genomes having character growth, Vivi himself grows to the point where he essentially becomes the wise figure of the group, the youngest, from the mouth of babes, the youngest individual in the group by leaps and bounds, by years and years and years, nevertheless ends up being the wise figure, the one who really thinks about things, the one who really puts the pieces together. And I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed the fact that in the end, he decided essentially the opposite of what Kuja did. Even though his life was limited, even though his life was artificial, and even though it was short. I guess limited and short are the same thing. it was still worth it to him. It was still worth continuing. And I liked that. I liked the fact that he decided to make that choice of his own volition rather than being forced or coerced into it. Garnet. Garnet Till Alexandros the 17th. Or Dagger. Or Sarah. That was her original name. That's right. Garnet is someone who... she goes through a bit of an interesting character arc because a character in another game later on will go through almost an entirely similar arc. That would be Ashelia Dalmasca in FF12. Starts out as someone who wants to help. Really, that's all it comes down to. And so she makes the decision to go against tradition, to go against the accepted norm, and to do something about it. And then she grows, and then she becomes, for lack of a better term, power hungry. She wants the power to do something. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just interesting, right? That's kind of the direction she moves in. And it reaches a point where she realizes what that power actually means, what people can actually do with that level of power that she demonstrates. And so she learns through horror, through shock, how to have a degree of control and moderation with regards thereto. And I actually really like the fact that she very much does this through her character arc. I like the fact that she is not static. She does not grow continuously. She does not descend continuously. She is very human in her actions and her reactions. When she loses her voice from sheer, utter, nightmarish shock, I liked that because it's too often in games, FFs as well, but RPGs in general, and video games in general, someone will go through a horribly traumatic act and then basically shrug it off. You know, there are some exceptions. A human being who just watched their entire city get destroyed right in front of their face and lost God knows how much and God knows how many would not... I think the thought that she lost her voice, I think the thought that she withdrew to such a point of introversion that she could not bring herself to speak makes perfect sense to me. And I thought that was actually a really nice touch. I think that really helped flesh out her character. And I like the fact that it was presented in gameplay, because from that point on, when she tries to summon or cast, she has a chance to fumble. She has a chance to fizzle because she can't find her voice. She can't find her courage. She can't find her center. And so, while that may be seen as an annoyance, it is a beautiful example of gameplay and story integration, and I really did like that. And by the end of the game, we have a Garnet who has seen firsthand the extremes. She has seen what it is like to be too pacifistic. She has seen what it's like to be too militaristic. She has seen what happened to her mother. She has seen what happened to Kuja. She has seen all of these nightmares of what war really is and what death really is. Indeed, her mother, her adopted mother, actually both of her mothers died on her. And that leaves a very important impression on a person, and I do like the fact that she grew from that and moved on from that and essentially vowed to be better for it. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention her quote really quick. Devotion. Someday I will be queen, but I will always be myself. Again, that is where her character arc started. And by the end of the game, she kind of does a full circle thing. She finally accepts the burden of leadership. Appropriately, she sees it as a burden rather than as a thing to be aspired to, and wants very much to... You get the very strong impression, they never have to say this, that she very much wants to rule in a way that ensures that those events will never happen again, at least not within her lifetime, so that no one else will have to go through what she went through. I like that. Next character. Now, this is a character that most people can't stand. Adelbert Steiner. His his quote is, "Dilemma. Having sworn fealty, must I spend my life in servitude?" Again, very well emphasizing the character, very well emphasizing where he is. He has a very strong sense of duty, a very strong sense of loyalty, and he hates it. He hates the fact that he feels so trapped and so restricted by his duty. There's no surprise that he and the other woman, the other sworn individual, I gotta look up her name, no, Beatrice, that's her name, are both basically mirror images of each other. The only difference is Steiner, it's interesting. Okay, let me put it this way. Beatrice went along with horrible, terrible acts because she was loyal to the queen, because her loyalty stayed with the queen. Steiner went along with acts that he hated, that he opposed, that he loathed, that he fought every inch of the way because of his loyalty to Garnet, the princess. And both of these characters hated what being loyal to a fault did to them. And both of them decided, through the course of the game and through the actions, to think for themselves. And both of them ended up together, and I thought that was really cool too. But anyways, Steiner grows so much as a character throughout the game. He starts off as such a fussbuzz, it's such an irritant, and it's interesting the way they do it, because he doesn't stop of his own volition, if you know what I mean. The moment Steiner is being aggravated and poked and frustrated and irritated the whole game until he and Garnet leave Lindblom in order to try and fix things themselves, right? That's the first time we start to see Steiner. Up until then, we've seen a fussbucket who has been frustrated, who has been irritated, who is following his duty, and who hates this stupid monkey boy, and oh god, I just want to get away from him, and he finally does. He finally gets away from him. He finally gets to actually be the knight to his princess, and we start to see Steiner as a person. And that's when his character growth really starts. We start to see how much he's been thinking about everything that's been happening as the game has gone on, and how much he has been considering, because he's not a mindless automaton. This is that life theme pulling back in here. Is, you know, in Steiner's case, it is reflected with the fact that he felt like a tool, a hammer, a wrench, for all his life, and it had been bothering him up till this point, and it wasn't until he finally got out and finally engaged in things and finally saw enough and then had time to stop and think about it that he realized he didn't want to be a tool. He wanted to be loyal, but not mindless. And there is a difference there. There's a huge difference. There is a code of honor that allows such a thing, and that's where Steiner ended up gravitating towards. And what we saw at the end was someone I would actually be proud, to put it honestly, to call a knight, rather than ashamed. And I really liked that. I really liked his character growth. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one here. I'm kind of running out of time, and it's really hot down here. Freya. Despair. To be forgotten is worse than death. Freya is very much the emotional character of the series. And again, her character growth is so well demonstrated right there. She is someone who has been banished, or I'm sorry, not banished. She has been in search of her love, who has not seen her in years. She has been lost. She has been alone. She sees her home annihilated. She sees her people brutally murdered. She sees many terrible things and acts, and when she finally meets her one true love, he doesn't remember her. Freya goes through a lot. I like Freya a lot. She's arguably my second favorite character in the game. Actually, I gotta say third, because I like Steiner, but point being, Freya is a very well done character. She is very much an emotional character, in a cast of so many people who are, thinkers, who are specific projections of life and characterization and humanization. What we have in Freya is someone who is very, very heart. Not a lot of thinking going on there. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's nice to see the contrast. Freya is someone who very much was, for lack of a better way to put it, distraught throughout the whole of the game, and it isn't until towards the end that she starts to finally come at peace with herself. And it's almost tragic in its own right, because in most cases when you have a character that is that tragic as Freya is, their character arc terminates in whatever was causing that tragedy, whatever was causing them that sorrow, to be fixed. In Freya, it is not. In Freya, her problem is never fixed. Her problems are never fixed. What happens is she decides that life is worth living anyways. She decides of her own volition to keep going, to find a reason, to keep trying, to keep bothering, to keep existing. And she finds her own new joys and her new purposes and her new friends. And I really like that. I really like the fact that Freya fell and then got back up on her own volition. And you don't see that a lot in a character. Kiana Quen, whose 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 quote is indulgence. I do what I want. You have problem? Um, I like Kiana a lot actually. Kiana is how do I even put it? Kiana is the actual humor character of the series as opposed to poor Vivi. Kiana is very much comic relief, and I think, and honestly, I don't actually have a lot to say about the character. He does have some complexity to him. Not complexity. He does have some depth to him. He does have more than just, I'm here for food, you know? But Kiana is very much someone who. He is very much someone who wants to see the good in situations. He is very lighthearted. He is very, and that's why he's so comical. And in such a serious and tragic and brutal and horrible game as FF9, you know, a lot of really bad things happen in FF9. Having a bright spot in the form of a character like this really was a good move, in my opinion, and more so because Kiana is effectively an optional character. You know, you have to have him for certain parts of the game. I'm not even positive if you have to have him in the game, but nevertheless, for most of the game, he is optional. You do not have to have him in the party. So that was also a good move because some people don't want that kind of comical outlet in the middle of a tragic and serious game like FF9 is. And so, honestly, I don't have much else to say there, unfortunately, but nevertheless, I thought that was a good move. Aiko Carol. Her quote is solitude. I don't want to be alone anymore. Again, a very tragic character. Aiko, there's a term for her, and I believe it's tsundere. I could be wrong. She is someone who puts up 15 different masks right here. Actually, that's a lie. She puts up a mask. One really thick, really strong mask. She throws up a wall and says, no, Aiko isn't here. This is what you're seeing. And I thought that was a little overdone, but they did kind of have to squash her character growth because of how far into the game you get her. Nevertheless, what you see in Aiko is someone who, despite her irritations, whenever you actually see the character, when you actually see the person behind that raving mask of being irritating, you see someone who is extremely vulnerable, extremely lost, and extremely alone. You see someone who has lived with Mughals by herself for years. And more or less as long as she can remember, actually. She barely remembers anything else. And I'm trying to think how best to put this. It makes so much sense that she would put on airs, that she would try to portray herself as more of an adult than she is, because she's kind of had to. She's kind of had to grow up. She's kind of had to do more and to aspire to more because she's been on her own. I mean, yes, she's had the Mughals, but you get my point. She has been on her own. She is the individual who has to deal with real-life problems and never had parents or anybody in order to help her deal with that. You also see someone who is extremely desperate is the word I want to use. Not in a bad way. I don't know how many people understand what the word desperate really means who's watching this, but when you go without something for a long time, and I'm talking years, it will reach a point where you will taste desperate, where you will taste that particular variety of hunger that really just defies words. And it's not always something, you know, horrible for anybody who's misunderstanding, but to bring this full circle, you know, bring this back to the point here, Aiko has been desperate for companionship before she had it. And then all of a sudden it was introduced to her. All of a sudden she found herself actually having human companionship, or, you know, living, thinking, being companionship. Actual other people she can talk with and be emotional with and engage with. Of course she fell in love with Zidane within 30 seconds. That makes, of course she did. Of course she wanted so desperately to go back with them. Of course she stuck to Garnet because she was so desperate for that completion of her existence, that hole that she had felt. And once she tasted it, she could not possibly go without it again. And so I thought Aiko was extremely well done and had a lot more depth to her than one might otherwise say. It's also worth noting that she's unarguably my favorite caster and one of the reasons main reasons I keep her around. But Either way, let's go ahead and go on to our final character, Amaranth Coral. Arrogance. The only thing dependable about the future is uncertainty. I liked Amaranth a lot. Amaranth was designed to fill the cool guy role. There's always been a cool guy. Well, there hasn't always been, but that's become a much more common thing. Auron filled that role in FF10, although he pulled it off really well, so no complaints here. Amaranth was designed to be a cool guy, and he very much portrayed that at first. He is also the only character in this list who actually has his backstory and his details in the past elaborated upon before. After the game starts. He's the only one. Every one of the ones you have some idea of what's going on before the game even begins. Aiko is another exception to this too a little bit, but the point remains. Amaranth, what we see is this big, hard, awesome-looking bounty hunter who terrifies everyone around him, who hardly ever says anything, who's really mean in a fight, blah, 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 right? And then we learn, through his own words, that he is an out-of-work security guard. And that's it. And so he just kind of went off and started doing his own thing, and he was good in a fight, and he had his mentality that, alone is better. And it wasn't until he was... I like this because too often you'll see a character like that, and someone else, an extrovert, in this case Zidane, will try to convince him that he's wrong, that togetherness works better and blah blah blah, and they'll just kind of go with it, and it won't make a lot of sense. In Amaranth's case, he actually poses a mission or a challenge to Zidane. He says, "Okay, I'm going to go in there by myself. You go in there with your party. I'm going to win. I'm going to come out. We're going to win." So you go in, go through this nightmarish dungeon, which, God, I hate replaying through that place, and manage to get back out. And everyone's like, "Yay, you won, congrats." And Zidane's like, "What?" Because Amaranth got stuck in there. And so they go back and save him. And I like that because Amaranth is shown point blank the actual benefits, the tangible benefits of being in a group, of working with people who care about you. And that's why he changes his mind, not because he just has some kind of change of heart, because he sees it in action. And that's exactly how it should work with a character like him. Now, I'm hoping I can find another quote here. I might not be able to. He has this wonderful quote when he encounters Merilith in the game. And Merilith basically says, "I've been killing people for so long because I can, because I'm the strongest, and therefore I have the right to." And he just kind of says, to summarize exceptionally, Amaranth says, "You're pathetic. I used to be just like you. I used to think strength was all that mattered, and I used to think strength meant I could do whatever I wanted. I used strength for nothing. It profiteth nothing. You are a fool to not use the strength you have to accomplish something, anything, other than your own irrelevant entertainment." And it was beautiful. That was his development, his character growth, because it took a while to get to that point. This is quite a ways into the game. It was actually really an awesome scene, and I really liked seeing Amaranth as he really as he had grown to, as he had changed to, as of that point. And I like that. I like that a lot. Now, let's go ahead and close this out because I'm done with that. Let's go ahead. What else do I have to talk about? Let's talk about the living world thing, finally. When most people ask me about FF9, this is actually the first thing I mention, believe it or not. Something that the Final Fantasy series has been trying to do since the beginning. Something that they have been succeeding at a little bit more and more. Something that I look for basically first in a game. Is how much of a world does it feel like? Now let me try and explain here. I talked earlier about flavor, right? And it's easy, there is a huge difference between a sandbox and a world, okay? Just Cause 2 is a sandbox, a huge open space to play in. Skyrim, actually I would say Morrowind to be honest with you, but whatever, is a world. It is a place that is living and breathing and continuing on in its own ways. And one of the biggest definitions of a world to me in a video game is the very distinct impression that the world goes on without you. That if you do nothing, the world keeps existing. And regardless of the plot, regardless of the story, regardless of the character arcs, that there is still a world behind all of that. FF9 is the first FF that really made me feel that world, Gaia, was a world, a living, moving, breathing world, and it was amazing. I still replay it just for that feeling, for the dock workers who are named, who are talking about their latest shipment of some material that, for the children playing in the street who are wondering if they can save up enough gold in order to buy the latest time, or is it Gil? I don't remember in this one. For the traveler from another city, from another district, who is worried about how they're going to get home in time. There is so much. I couldn't even begin to vocalize it. There is so much flavor and additive, and all of it is completely unnecessary. None of it had to be there, but they added it anyways to really flesh out the world, flesh out the setting, so it actually felt like you were existing in a place. And I love that feeling about FF9. And everything they did emphasized that feeling. And indeed, the theme of the game itself is finally cohesively brought together with this fact. The life of the world, life throughout the world in general, is basically what I'm getting to here. There's very much a feeling that there is simply life everywhere. And it's so amazing. It's so incredible. I love it. I love the way it pulled it off. There's I don't even know how to properly explain it, to be honest with you. I've already gone over most of the points I wanted to discuss specifically. The the fact that individual characters grow, the fact that you see personalities in NPCs that you only encounter twice, the fact that you here's another one. Okay, I've mentioned before translation issues, which continued all the way through FF7. Right, FF8 was the first game that was properly translated. FF9 was the first game that was beautifully translated. For the first time in FF9, in FF history, FF9, for the first time in the games, we finally were able to get dialect. We were actually able to get different dialects, different modes and patterns and accents of speech into the dialogue, because it was that well translated. And so we get the feeling of a drawl of someone who's a worker, or the aristocrat nature of someone who's a noble, or the standard, the professionalism of someone who's a shopkeep, or the professionalism of a different type, the militarism of someone who's a soldier. They actually managed to get it across in word choice and in little accents and apostrophes and all that fun stuff, in alternate spellings even. We were able to get across that feeling of accent, so while it wasn't voice acted, it might as well have been. And that really helped flesh out the world of FF9, and really did a very good job of doing so. And unfortunately, I don't actually have much else to say about this, but because I don't know what else there is to say about it. They made FF9 into a world. It felt, and this is one of the other reasons I talk about how the plot is so ultimately irrelevant. I shouldn't say irrelevant. It services the world, but FF9 is the only FF that, if the holodeck was real, right? One of the second world I would pick to go hop into would be FF9. Not FF9 the story. I would just say start the setting, remove Kuja, remove Garland, start the setting, let's go. And I could just exist in FF9's world for a while, because it is a fully living, breathing world. I'm sorry I keep reiterating this, but I don't have a better word for it. And I think that was marvelous. Now, let's get to my little final thing. I already talked about music. I don't have anything else to talk about there. The last dungeon of FF9 was unfortunately a bit of a disappointment and awesome both at the same time. It was definitely different. It was definitely very different. They were definitely going for a very different feel there. It was very off because they were going for a little bit too anime of a feel, if I might be honest. A lot of plot twists are revealed in the last dungeon. I'm okay with that. And the last dungeon had a very weird for weird's sake feel to it. They started doing this previously, and indeed have done this before, to much minor extents, but FF9's ending felt like FF9's last dungeon felt like an acid trip, basically. There were parts of it that made sense. There were parts of it that serviced the story. But otherwise, it was just like they were, okay, let's just throw something together. It was not the worst last dungeon I've seen like that in the FF series. That would be 10 for anyone who's wondering. But so much of it was just disconnected and unusual and weird for weirdness sakes that it was just like, eh. Now the music for the last dungeon was amazing. Now, ignoring the obvious crystal thing and the whole memory and life thing, it was done because Nobuo Uematsu said, you know what? because he'd already known at this point that this was going to be the last game he really worked on. Yes, I know he did songs in FF10, but this was Nobuo Uematsu's last FF. This was his baby, his last one that he was doing completely by himself. And he wanted the theme he crafted for the Final Fantasy way back in FF1 to be the theme for the final dungeon, to be the finale. And what it is it's this really hauntingly beautiful reverse. I don't even know how to explain it. It's the prelude theme, that thing, in almost in reverse. It's very hard to explain if you haven't heard it. I suggest you look it up. In all honesty, Crystal Memory, I believe, is the name of the song, and really, really well done song there. And the last boss, we're going to talk about this before we talk about the last thing. The last boss is Necron, the giant space-free flea from nowhere. He is pretty much the freaking definition of giant space flea from nowhere, and I think really wasn't necessary. I would have ejected the entirety of the Necron fight from the game if I had a choice on the matter. I really would. It doesn't add anything. It doesn't help anything. It actually detracts. The whole scene with Kuja, his final refusal, his realization within the last few seconds of his life, all of that was gold, and the stuff of epics. Squishing into the middle of that a boss fight with something you've never heard of before and never will again didn't help anything, didn't add anything. Yes, I know Necron is the personification of death and has decided that all life must now die and blah 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 blah. Guys, no, it just didn't work, okay? It didn't work. It was an interesting idea. You failed. Move on. There have been a lot of fan theories, and I've postulated my own, that Necron is a form of X-Death from back in FF5. There are a lot of similarities between the two. The truth of the matter is it's probably all just homages. Again, it's all just getting back to that whole, celebration of the series thing. I still think it should have been ejected, and really, I don't even have anything else to say about it. Now, Kuja. Kuja is a very interesting villain. He is extremely unstable. Not crazy. Not insane. If I were to be honest about it, I would say he seems very normal, to be completely honest with you. I would say he seems like a human being. He has a lot of emotional issues, a lot of emotional baggage. He tends to take things too far. He tends to be a little melodramatic on purpose to try and add spice to life because, frankly, life is boring to him, blah, blah, blah. He has this full... He actually kind of has this full circle of his character arc and then leaves that arc entirely and starts a new one, which I think is actually really interesting. Kuja starts off jealous, bitter, and very restrained, very focused. He wishes to please Garland and do his job for him and blah blah blah, except within a very short period of time he realizes that he wants to be off the leash, basically. In an ultimate irony, Kuja, the person who has been enslaving and creating mindless golems, wants very much to be alive and free. And so we see in Kuja someone who tries to extract himself from that. And all that he does to outdo Garland. And then he fails. And then he picks himself back up and he starts again. And then he has the realization about the trance and how that works. And he is so excited. He is so jubilant. And you see, this is when the character growth kind of comes full around. Because yes, he's going to kill Garland. Yes, he's going to do that. But for the first time, all of the fear, all of the terror that he had been experiencing, that he had been channeling into anger, channeling into cruelty, vanishes, because now he's not afraid anymore. Now he is jubilant, now he is exuberant, now he is joyful, and so he goes, uses all the souls of the trance, becomes incredibly, amazingly powerful, arguably the most powerful single individual in Final Fantasy history. He did blow up a planet by himself. I just feel like pointing that out. And at that point, yes, he will rule, yes, he will take over, but the way he phrases his words, you can tell he's still unstable, you can tell he's still unhinged, and that would still be a bad thing. But as of that point, it is arguable that he's no longer evil. that he has successfully come back and rebounded and basically had his own little redemption story and found a little more of himself. And then Garland, in spite, tells him the truth. Then he snaps. Then he loses it utterly and completely in again, a very human way. A very human way. And while his actions are not condonable and indeed awful and horrible, they're very realistic. And then, of course, the final caveat here, when Kuja finally... I'm going to diverge for just a moment, and I apologize if this offends anybody. I'm going to talk about suicide very briefly, okay? A lot of people say, I'm going to commit suicide, okay? Now, I'm not going to get into depth here. I'm only bringing this up for one very simple point. When you have the gun to your head and ready to pull the trigger, getting to this point is easy. Getting to this point is, for all intents and purposes, a joke. There is no effort, there is no cost, there is no consequence. When you reach this point, pulling that trigger is literally infinitely harder than everything you've done up to that point. And the reason for this is because the mind, or the heart, or whatever you want to call it, at some point in time, really, truly realizes that it is no longer just talk, it is no longer just theoretical, it is no longer hypothetical. You are about to shoot yourself. And that thought usually stops people. Obviously it does not always. But the reality of it, this is what I'm getting to, the reality of the now is a more important and impacting thing than most people ever realize. And it's not just for severe things like the example I just gave. That's obviously an extreme. But for a lot of people, when you get to the reality of it, when you're like, yeah, I'll go do this, oh my god. And there's just that moment of, as the reality of it hits you, and you're like, I'm not sure I can do this. I bring this up because Kuja was like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna wipe out all life. I'm gonna wipe out all life. And he couldn't do it. He realized in his very last moments... In the final... I've often said that you know who you truly are when you're at your worst. And Kuja was at his worst right at the end there, and he realized two things. That he wanted to live, and that in understanding that desire to live, he wanted others to live. Right at the end there. I've often said... I've heard people say that his turnaround, his redemption, was pat, was terrible, was poorly done. I disagree completely. He's not actually being redeemed. He is still a villain, and he still dies for his actions. But he does, in a way, come full circle in his second character arc. He finally realizes everything that he'd been missing all along. He finally realizes who and what he really is. And it takes a real moment of real... right there, actually about to happen in order to get that sometimes, here in real life. So I liked that. And I liked the fact that Kuja had that redemption right at the end there, and tried to save Zidane and his friends right at the end there, and had his final words with his brother. And one of the first things he said to him is... Second thing he said to him, actually, I believe, is, they got away, right? And Zidane says, yeah, they got away, and Kuja just relaxes, and he's like, good. I liked that. And it made a very unique type of sympathetic villain in Kuja. Now, this isn't as long as I thought it would be. And I apologize for my volume. I cannot speak at full volume down here for fear of waking people up. This is pretty much my option for the future for doing more reviews, as I will discuss in the comments for this, or I'm sorry, in the description for this video. I have been going through some things lately, and doing more videos is somewhat uncertain. I want to, obviously, since I'm here doing it. But I haven't really been with it emotionally or mentally enough to really sit down and do this like I usually can. So I apologize to everyone, and I hope that I can keep up interesting reviews in the future, because after all, I've still got 3 FFs to review. Anyways, I'll see y'all later.